We want to give Brother and Sister Moehlenpah time here. This is our final session, and they've come all the way from San Diego, California. We're honored to have them. Honored they've come. They're going to bless you one more time. Amen. Would you give the Lord a hand clap of praise? My teachers for many years ago that helped me make me what I am. I'm very thankful for God to put in the right people in your life. Always remember, God puts the right people in your life to make you who you need to be. Amen. God bless Brother and Sister Moehlenpah.
Praise the Lord. It is so good to be here. I have been blessed. Thank you, Brother Hannibal, for inviting us. Thank you for all the staff that's treated us so good. And now, one of the most important methods of teaching, one that Jesus used probably the most, storytelling. My wife.
You may be seated. You know, I think most people like to hear a good story, but you get the idea that unless you're just really trained or gifted, you can't tell stories. Well, during this session, I am going to share a secret with you that if you will apply it, you will be telling stories too. One writer said storytellers are like cooks. One cooks by being exactly like the recipe. If it calls for a quarter teaspoon, they make sure they take the back of the knife and scrape it off just right so you have exactly like the recipe says. The other person cooks with kind of like grace. They just take the recipe and maybe dump a few little things in there and add a few little things, and they just use it as a basis for making a dish. And so I'm kind of like that person that cooks by grace in the way I tell stories, because I will take a story, and it may be a very good story, but it's good to read, and as it's written, it's not a good story to tell because it's too detailed or some other thing needs, maybe the words that the author used are very good to read, but you don't talk like that. And so you change it around so that you are comfortable with those words. I feel that if a story is appropriate and well told, no matter what age group it's for, it can be enjoyed by all age groups. As a matter of fact, I think that if a good story is used and you mess up, it can still have a good impact. I want to tell you today about Hoppy, a big-mouthed frog. Hoppy had just finished his dinner of assorted bugs, and he decided he would hop around the neighborhood and see what other animals ate. So he started hopping on his way, and the first creature he saw was a bird. And Hoppy said, Mother bird, what do you feed your babies? And Mother Bird said, I feed my babies worms. And Hoppy says, oh, really? And he hopped on. Well, the next creature he saw was a cow. And Hoppy said, Mother cow, what do you feed your babies? And the mother cow said, I feed my babies milk. And Hoppy said, oh, really? And he hopped on. Well, after a while, he came to a swampy part of the neighborhood, and he saw an alligator. And Hoppy said, Mother alligator, what do you feed your babies? And Mother alligator said, I feed my babies big-mouthed frogs. And Hoppy said, oh, really? And hopped away as fast as he could, because he learned that if you don't stop to think before you speak, you could get in trouble. And you know what? We do the same. There was a new usher. He had been asked to usher in a church, and he didn't know everybody yet. And an elderly lady came into the church that he had never seen before, and he asked her, where would you like to sit? And she said, I want to sit on the front row. He said, well, ma'am, you know, our pastor is a very enthusiastic man. And when he preaches, sometimes he comes down and he walks real close to the front row, and you might find it more comfortable to sit farther back. And she says, young man, do you know who I am? And he said, well, no, ma'am, I don't. She said, I'm the pastor's mother. And he said, oh, do you know who I am? And she says, no. He said, good. Okay, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And formally, we would say that stories have an introduction, a body, a climax, a conclusion, and an application. The purpose of the good beginning is to capture the interest of your audience. Very few people can just speak off the cuff. I'm not one of those. I mean, I have to have my words. I have to know what I'm going to say. I can't just get up and say something and make sense. But we all can do it if we try. And so what you do is you spend time determining how you're going to start. You may have to try several different phrases or sentences to make it comfortable for you to get started in your story. But it's essential to have a good beginning. In the winter of 1935, Henry learned an important fact about prayer that he had never known before. He learned it was more than just an oral list of giving God what you needed or thought you wanted. It happened this way. You see the boys and girls in Henry's class and at home, they all walked to school. And it was a time when cash was hard to get. And so they all, if clothes wore out, they weren't replaced, they were just mended. And there were times at school when the children would just count to see who had the most mended places. And then if the soles on their shoes wore thin, they would just put a piece of cardboard inside because nobody had money. Well, on this particular cold, winter, snowy morning, as Henry was getting ready for school, he discovered his shoes were missing. And it was a serious matter because Henry only had one pair of shoes. So Henry went downstairs, and when Mother found out that Henry's shoes were missing, she began to delegate. And she says, now, Henry, you go right back upstairs to your room, and you check everything very carefully. Anna, I want you to go upstairs and look in the other bedrooms, please. And Hannah, I want you to check downstairs, and you can take the younger children, check here. And Daniel, I'm going to have to ask you if you would go outside and check. I know it's cold, but if Henry left his shoes outside, the dog probably has them in his bed under the house. So they all went to do as Mother had bid. Later they came back in, and they realized no one had found Henry's shoes. Now they all realized how serious it was because there were only 8 pairs of shoes in the family, 1 for each pair of feet. And they knew there was no money in Daddy's billfold or in Mother's purse or in the bank to get new shoes. Henry's shoes just had to be found. So Mother said, children, we're going to pray. God knows where Henry's shoes are. Now they all knew that Mother was a great believer in prayer because she prayed other times and God had helped her. Well, they all went into the front room. They followed Mother, and they all knelt down, and they all bowed their heads and closed their eyes, and Mother began to pray. She said, dear Lord, Henry has lost his shoes. You know that it's winter, and he can't go to school barefoot. Lord, you've promised to provide for all our needs, but we're not asking you for a new pair of shoes for Henry, merely for the old ones. And if you would show us where to look, we'd be forever grateful. Everyone was silent. And that's when Henry learned that new thing about prayer, that when you have questions for the Lord, you should give him time to answer. So Mother waited and waited and waited, and she said, thank you, Lord. Amen. 6 pairs of expectant eyes watched as Mother rose and went toward the kitchen. 6 pairs of feet, 1 minus shoes, followed. And 6 mouths opened in amazement when Mother opened the oven door, because there were Henry's shoes. To this day, no one knows who put Henry's shoes in the oven, but they all know who told Mother where to look. So that's a good lesson for all of us to learn. If you have questions for the Lord, give him time to answer. Now, the introduction is the beginning of the story. It should be brief, but it should give you enough information that you want to know more about what happened. You know, when you meet somebody and they introduce, it's really kind of nice to know more than just the name. It's nice if you catch the name, but if they'll say something like, Brother Hadabah did, that we were from San Diego. You may have visited San Diego. And so then we can start a conversation. So when you're, it's kind of hard to keep a conversation going when all you know is the name. But I want to introduce you to a couple of our friends, Wayne and Jane. They had a large family. And one day, Jane found out there was some money missing from her purse. And she knew, because of the circumstances, that one of the children had taken that money. So Jane approached each of them separately, and she began to explain about the money, and she said, "Now, did you take the money?" And nobody confessed. Now, Jane began to think about it, and she said, "You know, Lord, I can't let whichever one of the children take that money and get by, because that's stealing, even though they took it from me. And I don't want them to grow up thinking they can steal." So she prayed and asked the Lord, "How could I know which one took the money?" Now, Wayne and Jane had named all their children Bible names. I'm not exactly sure, but I've always thought it because she wanted God to play an important part in each child's life. So on this particular day, she called everybody in the room, and she lined the family up. It was a large family. And she began again to tell how that she knew somebody had taken the money from her purse. Which one had done it? And she just said, "Does anybody want to confess?" Well, nobody did. So Jane said, "Well, you know, I have prayed and asked the Lord to help me know who took the money. And so I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to open my Bible, and God is going to show me which one of you took the money. Does somebody want to confess?" And she looked at each child, and no one confessed. So Jane said, "Well, we're going to pray." And so she began to pray, and afterwards she opened her Bible and began to look through the Bible. And then she said, "Timothy, did you take that money?" And Timothy began to weep and confess, because he was the one who took the money. And it made a big impression on all the children that day, because they realized God knows everything, and he can tell your mother. And folks, he can tell your pastor too. Now, the introduction can also, we're going to spend a little time on this, can set the scene for the story. If you're telling one of the Bible stories, it's interesting if you will open your Bible to the place where it is, and they will realize this is where this came from. Or you could just use a map to indicate where the story took place. The introduction can also answer the story of who, what, when, or where. Jesus introduced two stories this way. He said, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho." So he answered the question of what, he answered the question of who, and he answered the question of where. Another one, he said, "A certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return, and he called his 10 servants and delivered them 10 pounds and said, 'Occupy till I come.'" Now, that's quite an introduction. He asked who it was, what, he planned the journey, he delegated authority, he gave instructions, and then the old familiar "once upon a time." It's okay to start a story like that too. Your introduction can explain the point of the story. Jesus told the story of a coin that was lost, a sheep that was lost, and a boy that was lost. He shared the responses of people who had lost and cared about lost things. Now, I have some tapes that I use in teacher training, and some of you who were in the last session, you heard a couple. And as I mentioned, it's not one of those things that you can do on Saturday night. You have to prepare ahead of time. You have to practice. Well, we were going out of town to teach, and unfortunately for me, I did not start on Monday of that week to get ready for the trip. And about 2 days before, I started searching for the tapes. Well, I discovered that although I had known in Stockton, California, exactly where those tapes were, we had since moved to San Diego, and I didn't know where I put them. And I looked and looked and looked, and I was so frustrated because 2 days, and I knew I couldn't replace them, and I needed them. So I did like Henry's mother. I went into the front room and I sat down in the chair and I just prayed and I said, now, Lord, you know I need these. And then I gave the Lord a chance to talk to me. And after sitting there for some time, just very quietly, I feel the Lord inspired me where to look. And I did. I looked in a place that I had not looked before, and there was my box of tapes, exactly what I needed. And so I was really happy that I found those tapes, and I couldn't hardly wait to tell my husband, I found the tapes, really excited about it. Well, I want to tell you about, speaking of losing things, a story of Ken Jones and how he lost something and his response. Ken Jones and his wife Randy, along with his mother and father and their 2 children, decided that they would spend the day in San Francisco. Well, they wanted to make it more exciting, so they took the BART, which is the Bay Area Rapid Transit, across the Oakland Bay. They wanted to spend time, it was their first time to ever ride the BART, and they wanted to spend time with all the instructions, but the regular commuters just were hurrying them up. Hurry, 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 we've got to get to work. And so finally they got their tickets and they got on the BART. They rode across the bay, and then they went to the city center and they got off that. They went up an escalator and they got on a cable car and went to the wharf. Now that's an exciting place to be. You can do a lot of things in the wharf and see a lot of things. And so they spent time pushing Nathan, who was 2.5, in the stroller, and then, well, Nathan was the baby, and then carrying Marcus, who was 3. But they had said, we need to get out of here by 3 o'clock so we won't get caught with all those regular commuters. So after spending time in Chinatown and walking around and buying a few things, they went back to the city center, and they went down the escalator and turned left toward where their train would be. Ken's mother was talking with him about some things they had done that way, and Randy was carrying the diaper bag and the purchases they'd made, and Ken was pushing Nathan in the stroller, and Ken's dad had decided that he would stop and watch some construction. And Marcus was gone. They couldn't find Marcus anywhere. And in just a few seconds, and they realized it, and Ken began running up the escalator with Randy right behind him. They were running as fast as they could because Marcus was lost. And they got a station agent. They began to explain to him, our son is just 3 and he's lost, and you have to help us find him. We don't know where he is. And the man said, well, I need a description. So they began to tell how that he was just 3. He was a certain size, had on a little tan coat and a little tan hat, and he had auburn hair, and he's just 3. The man began to broadcast this down the BART line. And as he did, Ken said he began to pray. And he took Randy's hands, and he said it wasn't like the prayer he prayed over his oatmeal in the morning. It wasn't like the prayer he prayed when he went to bed at night, because Marcus was lost. And they prayed out loud, and they were saying, Jesus, you know where Marcus is, and we want to find him, and we don't know where to look, and he's so alone, he must be scared, and help us get him back, Lord. And he said it seemed like hours because they were so concerned, but just seconds after he had finished praying, this voice came over the sound system and said, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Randy Jones, you may pick up your son at the Powell Street Station. Well, they began to run again. They went down the escalator. They got on the train for the Powell Street Station. And when they got there was Marcus in the arms of a security agent. They discovered that nobody had taken Marcus. It was just when they went down that escalator and turned left, Marcus turned right. There was a train waiting with the doors open. He got on, the doors shut, and Marcus was off, alone, except for Jesus and a train full of strangers. Well, he was there in the arms of the security agent. His face was all red and swollen and wet because he cried so hard. And when he saw his mom and dad, he put his arms out and he says, you guys got on the wrong train. Well, there were a lot of hugs and kisses when they went back that day. And Marcus didn't say much at all at first. He just stood by Ken and put his arm around his neck, and they were hugging each other. And then Marcus said, Daddy, what would you do today if you didn't find me? What would you do if I'd stayed lost? And Ken said, well, I can tell you, Marcus, 2 things would have happened. One is I would never have stopped crying, never. And I would never have stopped looking, never. And Ken wanted to tell us about this story of his and what happened, because he wanted to remind us that there is a lot of people in the world who stayed lost today. And they don't know that Jesus is very close to them and willing to help them. But he's expecting us to keep looking for them. So keep that in mind. The introduction. Did I miss one? No. The introduction should anticipate without predicting the end. There are a lot of times when we get to thinking, well, these kids have heard these stories so often that they already know what's going to happen. But I want to share this little tidbit that explains how kids often look at stories. There were two little boys who were watching a Western on television. And as they sat there, there was a man who was being chased by the posse. And he was riding his horse, and they looked ahead, and there was a big cliff. And Ray, all of them thought, uh-oh, he's going to ride off that cliff. So Ray said to Mike, I bet you 5 cookies that man rides his horse right off the cliff. Mike said, okay, you're on. So they watched very carefully, and sure enough, the man rode his horse right off the cliff. So Mike paid up 5 cookies, and they sat there and continued to watch the Western. And Ray said, you know, Mike, I need to tell you something. I feel bad about taking your cookies, even though I've already eaten them, but I've seen this movie before. And Mike said, that's okay, I have too. I just didn't think the guy would be dumb enough to do it twice. The middle of the story is where the action and the major events take place. That's where all this happens, and it's leading up to the climax. There could be a lot of suspense in Bible stories if we would just put it in, and you describe the characters and the settings and so forth. Before I go on, though, I want to explain that that also can be a brief drama. You choose a dramatic portion of your story, and you stop at that point, and then go do something else. You might take up the offering, you might count, see who's there, welcome your visitors, or whatever. I heard about one man, they said he rode the bus with the children who were coming on the bus, and so he would tell the story and make sure it lasted till they got to church at a very exciting point, and he'd say, oh, we're here at church. Well, I'll see you after church, kids. Well, they wanted to know what happened. And that's the way you do this. You start about, you know, it's very important for us to follow directions carefully. You know, if you were given a map or just told how to get to somebody's house and you make a wrong turn, maybe you turn left and they've told you turn right. And even if you kept on all the other directions, you would end up where you didn't plan to go. Well, it's very important for us to follow directions carefully, even with cooking. Because if you don't follow directions, I know you can play around with it, but if you put like a tablespoon of salt in when it calls for a teaspoon or less, it's really going to change the texture, the taste of the way your recipe turns out. Well, on this particular 8 o'clock, on this particular morning in September of 1944, an aimless, raggedly dressed old man of 82 collapsed on a sidewalk in New York City. A lot of people saw him laying there, and he was just retching, and they passed him up because they thought, he's drunk. Well, a policeman came along, and he thought the man was drunk too, till he got close enough to see that the man's lips and nose and ears and fingers were sky blue. He was admitted to the hospital about 8:30, and 2 hours later, another man with the very same symptoms was admitted to the hospital. During the morning, more and more men, just with the same symptoms, was brought to the hospital. At noon, there were 10 men. And then late that evening, an 11th man who had been too sick to call for help, he was brought to the hospital. All the men were elderly. All the men were raggedly dressed. They were in poor state of health. All were rigid. All were in shock. And all were sky blue. Now, you might wonder that there have been times when you've been in a service and if somebody tells a story, the preacher maybe, and then he gets inspired to tell another story, and he never goes back and finishes that first story. And don't you want to know what happened? Yes, you want to know. And in fact, I get so frustrated sometimes that I want to go up and ask them what happened, but I don't have the nerve. But I would really like to know what happened to some of those stories that they tell us about. Now, Jesus, he did it the right way. He was on the way to Jairus' house, and he was interrupted by a lady who had a problem. And he took care of her problem, but he didn't forget his first purpose, and he went on to Jairus' house and raised his daughter from the dead. So remember, when you get distracted, or you have distracted yourself purposely, go back and finish your first story. Now, do you want to know what happened to those blue men? What made them blue? Buy the book. I'm joking. It is in the book. But investigators discovered that all 11 men had eaten at the same restaurant. And they discovered that all men had oatmeal. And they discovered that in the kitchen, the cook's helper had been very careless, and he had filled all the salt shakers in the kitchen and all the salt containers, and those out in the restaurant, instead of filling them with salt, he filled them with sodium nitrite. Well, the cook, when he made the oatmeal, he just grabbed a handful of the stuff and dumped it in the oatmeal. And the men, a lot of them had been having problems with drinking, and they added a lot of salt to their oatmeal, and it became a toxic dosage. Those 11 men really suffered a lot of pain. One of them died, all because 2 men were careless with the way they were handling food. They didn't follow the directions carefully. But you know what? It's even more important for us to handle this very carefully. We need to know what we're talking about and how to explain things to people that are in need. And so we need to follow the directions in there very, very carefully. The climax is the high point of the story. Now, in Mary's story that I told you about, Wayne and Jane, when Jane opens her Bible and reveals who stole the money, that's the climax. That purpose is revealed. So once the climax has been revealed, then we know that kids are going to lose interest, or people who are listening to you are going to lose interest, so it's time to close the story. The conclusion means it's time to stop. And when this story doesn't end with a real punch, you can just say, well, now you've heard the story of the 11 blue men. And that kind of gives it an ending. But you don't want to end your stories like this by saying, now what I'm trying to say is, and you keep on and on and on, because hopefully you did what Brother Moehlenpah taught us to do yesterday, the aims and objectives. And we had that in our mind, and so we knew exactly what points we were trying to cover, and we stuck with what we were doing. But if you still feel like you didn't get it across, then in the memory work or some other part of the lesson, try to get it in through there. Tie up the loose ends and leave the characters accounted for. The first rule of the application is you don't admit it. You apply the stories to the listeners. Now, sometimes you can tell a story and people just get it. You can just see when they get what you're going at. But a lot of times with children, you have to tell them what you were trying to say. And the reason is because of the children, their ages, they don't always accept hints. My sister taught me that. When she was, her children were young and the neighborhood children would come over to play, they would just stay and stay and stay. And she finally said, don't you think it's about time you would go home? And they said, no, Mama said we could stay here as long as we wanted to. Well, of course she did. So my sister learned to say, you have to go home now because we're going to have lunch and you can come back at 2 o'clock and we'll maybe play for an hour then. And that's the way it would go. Well, Ed Palomar's wife she had a chance to do a choice. And she said, I am not going to wear a seatbelt. She refused. She said, you know, if I ever have an accident, I will only hurt me. Well, one day, it was very clear, the weather was not bad. She lost control on her way home. Her car went off the road and hit a tree, and she was horribly hurt. She was intestinal. She had a lot of internal injuries. Her facial bones were broken. Just so many things had happened to her in that wreck. She was wrong. She said, it won't hurt anybody but me. But Ed had to take care of her. In fact, he had to close his business so he could take care of her and their 2 daughters. And he lost his business. He lost his home because of all the big medical bills that they had. Now, she said, won't hurt anybody but me if I don't wear a seatbelt. But you know what? Ed was hurt because he lost his wife. His children were hurt because they lost their mother. They lost their home. The whole family was hurt because they were left with big medical bills. Because, see, she lasted in pain. She lived in pain, a lot of pain, spent a lot of time in the hospitals over the next 6 years after her accident. And then she died, and they were left with all these big medical bills. But you know what? Ed and his daughters are very close, and he doesn't have to tell them to wear a seatbelt. Am I telling you this story so that you'll wear your seatbelt? That's a good idea. You know, most states, in fact, I think it's all of them. It's the law. But it is a good idea. I wanted to explain to you, though, that your choice isn't always just up to you. You may say, it really won't matter if I live for God consistently or not. It only affects me. But actually, it affects your family. It affects people who know you, who you influence. And really, it affects people that are watching you that you are not even aware of that are watching you. It is your choice, but think about it. I'm just going to throw this in. When I was a teenager, before I had started going to church, I'm from a very small town, and they had a YWCA, and a lot of times the young people from the town, small town, would gather at the YWCA, and we would play cards or shuffleboard or ping pong. Well, one day there were a group of us, and we were standing at the door just to let the breeze come in, and we were watching, and one of the young Pentecostal girls walked by. And they said, somebody, I don't remember who it was now, but they said, you know what? Doris would never cut her hair. Well, you know where I'm going? Doris has cut her hair. And all those people that she could have influenced that were in that room that day, her choice affected a lot of people. So just remember, she had no idea we were talking about her as she walked by. And somebody may be talking about you as they see you do things too. Okay, you make the application by making a statement. You can just say, it's very important to follow directions carefully. Jesus said, go and do thou likewise. That's what he did. Then you can make the application by asking a question. Sometimes you do it rhetorically. You ask the question, but you're not really expecting them to answer. But if you are expecting them to answer, then you need to watch your questions. One teacher had told the story of the Good Samaritan, and she said to her students, what would you do if you came across somebody lying in the road all covered with blood? And they thought about it, and one little girl said, I think I'd throw up. Wasn't what the teacher wanted, but how could she have asked her question differently? She could have said, how could you help someone? Make it more specific. Maybe they would say, you call 911, or you get an adult, or some other thing, but they're thinking along the right line. And then you keep it simple. If you just try in the time that you've got for a normal Sunday school lesson to do 1 or 2 points, you're probably going to do a better off than if you're trying to give them the whole Bible in one class time. So where do you put the application? In the introduction. You can just start out by saying, like I did, it's very important to follow directions carefully, and you get that in their mind. Okay? You can say it during the story. Sometimes groups will say you should stop your story at different times and emphasize again the point that you are trying to get across. You could weave it through the story, or you could tell it after the story. And the reason you do that is one of the best ways it's retained longest. Now, here's the secret to telling stories. I told you I was going to reveal it, and that's it. It's just hard work. It's just practice. You have to do it again and again and again. There are a few things in life that you can do without practicing. Usually you breathe. Nobody has to teach you how to breathe. You just do that. But nearly everything else is a result of having acquired a skill. And telling stories is an acquired skill, and you can learn how to do it. You tell it to yourself. You maybe will change some of the voices or the characters, sound effects, and then you tell it standing up, emphasizing gestures or whatever. Now, some people, they are able to do this because they get very, very excited. They're very excitable people, and they just jump around and do everything. Well, I don't say it's just my age, but that's not the way I tell stories. But each of us have a way that we can do it, and it can be very effective. And if you are very enthusiastic, that's good too. Now, I did have one student who started a story this way, and she said, "Help me, I'm drowning." And I thought, I don't know about you, but if I was drowning, I think I'd make a little bit more noise than that. And so that's what we need to do. Athletes practice, actors practice, musicians practice, and storytellers practice. Now, where can you practice? While driving. But if you do that, you have to be prepared for people to look at you kind of funny, because they wonder, who are they talking to? Now, it's becoming a little more common now because people have these earphones, and they're talking on the cell phone, so it is a little more common. But if you're like me, that's not the best place to practice, because sometimes I get so engrossed in the story that I forget to move when the light turns green. And then you got the people behind honking, oh yeah, I'm supposed to move. And then a place that I found over the years that was one of my best places was in the garage. When the rest of the family had gone to sleep, and if it was cold, I would take a blanket and I would go out and sit in the garage in the car, and then I could just practice as much as I wanted to. I could tell it as many times as I wanted to or do whatever, and it didn't bother anybody else. And I'm kind of shy that way anyway. I don't like to do it before I've really practiced. I don't want anybody to hear me, so that was the perfect place to go. It also, you could use a tape recorder. I doubt that you are going to be able to practice too much. It's kind of like learning to drive a stick shift. If you learned how to drive a stick shift and you had to put that clutch in and all the rest of the stuff, it has to go just right and shifting and everything. And when you first started, the car would buck along. Well, sometimes when you're first starting to tell stories, that's exactly what happened. You're just bucking along. You don't really know where it's going to go or how it's going to do, so you just have to keep practicing. And pretty soon you get very smooth, and you can shift from one gear to the next and go on. Well, that's the way it is with stories and telling the stories. You have to study every time you tell the story. I would like to have somebody come up here and help me by holding this mic for me. Just holding the mic, because I'm going to ask you, this is a participation story. I'm going to have to take my shoes off because I don't want to fall off this platform. Okay, who'll do it? Oh, good. My favorite man. He usually tells people we've been married almost 48 years. We got married young. No, we didn't. Anyway, I want you all to stand up. You don't have to say what I'm going to say, but I want you to do what I do. Get into this story with me. Okay, now we are the Israelites, and we've just been told that we can leave Egypt. Okay, here we go. We're just walking, this is great. I have never been so free. I didn't have to pick up straw today. I didn't have to make bricks, just walking and walking. It was just wonderful. But I get to thinking about it, and you know, Pharaoh has said we could go away, but he's changed his mind before. I think I'd like to speed up a little bit. In fact, I think I'd like to run. I want to get as far away from Pharaoh as I can. Oh, no, look behind you. It's Pharaoh and his army, and they're coming after us just like I thought he would. Oh, what are we going to do? Oh, no, look ahead of you. It's a big body of water. How are we going to get by? Pharaoh's army is coming after us, and there's water in front of us. What are we going to do? Oh, God, help us. We don't know what to do. And he says, stop. Look at Moses. He's lifting that big stick, and whoosh, the water is going apart. And there's a dry place for us to walk through. I'm getting over there as fast as I can. I don't know about you, but I want to hurry. Oh, no, look behind you. It's Pharaoh and his army, and they're coming after us. They're using our dry land to get over to the other side and catch us. Oh, what are we going to do? And we hurry, and everybody gets over. And look, the water is going whoosh, swoosh. And it covered up Pharaoh and his army. God is so great. He brought us through. There's no other God like you. Hallelujah. Okay, folks, you've been great. I tried to tell you about storytelling. My last words are Jesus' words. Go and do thou likewise.